Alright guys, Murph's here, and today, at viewer request, we're going to talk about this. A Glock, Model 25, chambered in 380. Now, in order to talk about this, we are going to talk about a little bit of history. However, I am going to go ahead and forewarn you guys. There are a couple of rabbit holes laced throughout this history portion. So, if I'm taking too long through any particular portion, or you don't really have an interest in the history portion, go ahead and check the description where I have the chapters laid out and hop to content that you want to consume. For the rest of you, some of you who are perhaps aware of how Glock does their model designations, but not necessarily intimately aware of all of Glock's different offerings, might be surprised to hear me refer to this as a Glock 25, because that would put it relatively early in the Glock catalog. For those of you who don't know, the Glock 17 is referred to as the Glock 17 not for its 17-round magazine, but it's because it was Gaston Glock's 17th patent. Every Glock that has come out afterwards has gone sequentially in order of release for designation. So the next pistol to come out was the Glock 18, which is the full automatic version of the Glock 17. After the Glock 18 came the Glock 19, which is the compact version of the Glock 17, of which this is similar in size. This is a Glock 19 size 380. Glock 20 is the 10mm version. That was the next gun to come out, so on and so forth. The only real changes in there is if there's some sort of product improvement to a specific model. So in the case of the 19X, we carry a letter designator added onto the nomenclature because the grip on the 19X is longer than a standard 19, but it is a 19 length barrel. They also could have given it a completely different designation. It really wouldn't have changed all that much, but they did not. So here we are. Okay, so Glock 25, Murph, that's fairly early, and that is the case. This came out in 1995 when you consider that Glocks hit American shores in about 86, somewhere in the mid-80s. And this was marketed towards South America. Now, why was this marketed towards South America and a couple of other European countries? Well, there's actually two parts to this answer for this particular question. First off, the 1968 Gun Control Act set forth quite a few measures against the importation of foreign-made guns. And one of the biggest things that we see in this is the advent of the sporting use clause, which we see sometimes pop up in anti-gun legislation since then. And this is basically stating that firearms need to meet certain sporting parameters. They're not supposed to be able to bring in like military guns. In order to pursue this goal, the 1968 Gun Control Act outlined a bunch of point system. I don't know how better to say that other than to say that they outlined a point system in order to be able to determine whether or not a firearm qualified for importation. Now, we're not going to get full into the point system and all that kind of stuff. That could be a whole video on its own. But it is important to point out that the smaller a gun is, and you combine that with smaller caliber, the harder it is for the gun to be able to achieve points. So a perfect case in point is the Walther PPK. A true pattern Walther PPK has not been imported in the United States in quite some time. Walther came up with the PPK-S, which has a slightly lengthened grip, in order to be able to meet the import restrictions outlined by the 1968 Gun Control Act. So when manufacturers are looking to import their firearms and are having issues with the point system, they have one of two options. They can modify their firearm, also seen in the Browning Model 1922, which had an adjustable iron sight version imported in the United States, even though that's not what most people would consider a target gun to begin with. Or you could just not import guns into the United States. Glock decided that since they already had the Glock 19 in the United States, that they would just go ahead and market this to South America and a couple of European countries. Now, why would this be more enticing to South America and some European countries, Murph? Well, that is because some countries in South America and in other places have a restriction against the private ownership of firearms chambered in military and police cartridges. And seeing as 9mm is the quintessential police and military cartridge of today, you wouldn't be able to own a Glock 19, but you could own a gun in the same size chambered in 380. That's where the Glock 25 came from. Now, Murph, wouldn't there have been an interest in the United States? I mean, the United States has been buying up Glocks for a long time. Millions have been sold there. Possibly, but we also need to remember that the U.S. consumer has never been that terribly interested in 380, especially in large 380s. And I've talked about this in other videos before. Most Americans think of 380s as being pocket guns of some sort, and also of the 380 cartridge being suboptimal for self-defense, which if you're interested in that discussion, I do have a 380 cartridge discussion video. Go ahead and check out the link in the description. So something of this size has never really caught on. There's been a couple of different attempts, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Now, Murph, what about the Glock 42? Okay, that's a Glock product that's available in the United States, and it's here. Like, people are buying it and stuff like that. How does this figure into this overall equation? Well, the Glock 42 came out in about 2014. Previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description, by the way. That gun was built in a U.S. Glock factory, which is another option that foreign manufacturers and importers have. They can open a U.S. branch of manufacturer in order to be able to provide guns that would be difficult to import. And that's what Glock did with the 42. Now, it would take some years, but in 2023, Glock would be talked into bringing in the Glock 25 and the Glock 28, which is the Glock 26 size 380, to the United States on a limited production run basis, with a teaser that if the gun sold well enough that they might continue production here in the United States. Now, why in 2023? Well, in the past couple of years, 380 handguns have had a bit of an increase in popularity. I don't even know if I necessarily want to say popularity. More 380 handguns have been coming to market. I don't know if they're necessarily selling all that well, but we have the Shield EZ 380. Ruger came out with a couple of different versions of like non-pocket size 380s. The Bodyguard 2.0 for Smith & Wesson is also available now. Like, there's a lot of guns chambered in 380 that suddenly popped up. You can see where Glock was like, okay, well, maybe we'll give this a swing. You know, we've got U.S. manufacture going on right now. Why don't we go ahead and introduce this to the U.S. market and see how it does? It would seem that we did not meet whatever threshold was required in order for production to continue, because this gun discontinued this year in 2025, along with 24 other products from Glock, which it seems like Glock is pretty much clearing everything out of their product line that isn't a 9mm and isn't under contract, which I am not a big fan of that. One of the things that I always liked about Glock is that I like the Glock formula. As much as people say they haven't been innovative and all that kind of stuff, they produced a great product right off the bat. Reliable, lots of aftermarket support and all those types of things. I like that you can get the Glock formula in a variety of chamberings and sizes and all that kind of stuff. And I understand why Glock is going to pretty much just 9mm handguns that have contracts associated with them, but it would have been really cool if they had kept the rest of the product line alive. Like, this is a very bean counter driven decision to decide that they're just going to consolidate, produce 9mm handguns under contract instead of like a wider product line where they're accommodating their customers. So it's a very HK answer to business. So not necessarily a company that I would want to emulate, because HK hates you. All right. I think that pretty much covers history. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular handgun? Right at the bat, we have Glock's signature plastic sights with the white dot front and the white outline rear. These are much derided for sights, and I have to say that I 100% agree with it. At one time, I defended these sights, and I will maintain that these sights will get you to the range. But if this is going to be a serious use gun, be it competition or self-defense, duty use, whatever, I implore you to upgrade these sights post-haste. As much as I haven't gone through my entire collection of Glocks and updated all of my sights, it's difficult for me to just like, I have a lot of projects going on at any given moment, guys. I have a lot of things that I'm updating, refining, and all those types of things. So I'm working my way through my Glock line, my Glock collection, in order to upgrade all the sights. But now when I buy Glocks, that is one of the first things I do on Glocks is upgrade the sights. Now we have a 3.5-inch barrel that is polyagonal rifled. Now what does that mean? That means that the internal portion of the barrel was formed around the rifling. This is supposed to increase accuracy and velocity. Accuracy is not an interesting conversation to me when it comes to handguns. Accuracy is far too dependent on the shooter, and most handguns would actually outshoot the shooter. But it's important to note the polyagonal rifling because this does not behave very well with lead bullets. If you shoot a steady diet of them through there, it's going to leave leading in the barrel, and over time that's going to create a barrel obstruction. You're going to have an overpressure event. Gun's going to go bang. Like boom, not like bang. All right, our slide is gas nitride treated. Something that was introduced with the Gen 3 guns. This is a Gen 3 Glock, by the way. Now, something that's important to note is that this does not operate in the same way that most Glocks do. And that is to say that most Glocks utilize a Browning tilting cam system with a locked breech. So if we compare that against this Glock 19M, we can see on the 19M, we have this very sharp face, this sheer cliff face here on the barrel shank, or the cowling. Whereas on the 25, let me get my fingers out of the way, on the 25, we see here we have an inclined plane. That is because the Glock 25 works off of direct blowback, which is pretty common in 380 chambered pistols. Now, since I got them apart, also we have the flat wire Gen 3 recoil spring as opposed to the newer Gen 4 and Gen 5 double captive recoil spring. Since they're in pieces, might as well go ahead and cover that. So the barrel still tilts like a Browning tilting cam, but there is no lockup. Lockup or chamber sealing is achieved by spring tension as well as slide weight in order to make sure that the chamber is sealed up long enough for pressures to drop to a safe extraction point so that you don't have like out of battery detonation and all that kind of stuff. We're going to talk about that more once we get into shooting. Now, we do have a loaded chamber indicator located here on the extractor, and longtime viewers of the channel know that I'm not a big fan of loaded chamber indicators, least of all the ones on Glocks. I feel like this was an afterthought. I feel like somebody left some additional material on the extractor, and then someone's like, is that a loaded chamber indicator? And they were like, yeah, sure is. So I don't find the loaded chamber indicator on Glock pistols or most loaded chamber indicators to be tactile, so I don't consider them to be effective in low light conditions where you would probably be better off feeling for a round in the chamber as opposed to trying to feel and be sure that the gun is in fact loaded. Now, I'm a big fan of press checks. A lot of people seem to be violently against press checks. They accuse you of being some sort of tactical douche and all that kind of stuff. However, the most important thing at the end of the day is to know whether or not your gun is loaded. So X-ray vision, press check, loaded chamber indicator, conversation with an omniscient being, you need to do whatever it is that it takes in order to be able to be 100% certain that your firearm is loaded. Because I have seen far too many times where people have stepped up to the line at a competition or a course or something like that, drew their gun and had a click no bang, all because they didn't take 2 seconds to check and make sure the gun was loaded. In the past, I've actually left the house with an unloaded gun. I was in a rush. I grabbed my 43X, threw it in a holster, threw it on my belt, and then rushed out the door. And then I got home and went to clear the gun out in my gun room, and there was no bullets in it. A press check before I left the house would have shown me that. So I prefer to utilize press checks in order to be able to be certain of the condition of my firearm. All right, see, we have some slide serrations. They are deep enough, as much as, this is a really great finish. It's a little slick, but I don't notice it in the slide serrations. I have no problem grabbing these and being able to function them accordingly. This is, of course, a striker-fired gun. Like all Glocks are. On the front of our dust cover here, we do have our Glock rail in order to be able to mount lights and lasers if you so choose. Our slide release is single-sided. And now, is this a slide release or a slide catch? Well, is the glass half empty or half full? Am I filling the glass or am I drinking out of the glass? There are some people out there who will tell you to never use your slide catch as a slide release, that you should only ever overhand rack slides and all that kind of stuff. As much as I overhand rack slides, it's not because I don't think that this is an effective means to be able to release your slide. Quite the contrary, actually. I run overhand racking of slides on all of my guns because I train on a wide variety of handgun platforms. I compete with a wide variety of handgun platforms. So I have slide releases that are located in a bunch of different locations. I don't necessarily want to have a fumble trying to find my slide release. So instead, I rack the slide because that's always in the same location. Now, I say all of that to say that when I'm making recommendations, I have to acknowledge that the slide release reload is the most efficient form of reload. With that being the case, When I'm evaluating handguns, there are three things that I want accessible from my strong side grip. And that is my slide release, a safety if one is present, and my magazine release. And this meets that requirement. I can absolutely function the slide release with my firing grip. All right, let's go ahead and talk about our trigger guard here. We have a squared off trigger guard. It does have serrations on the front of it. So if you're somebody who grips the front of the trigger guard, more power to you. I utilize a thumbs forward grip. I haven't really gripped the trigger guard in some years, though I am starting to change that on some of the guns I shoot in order to help with some other aspects of handling the firearm, not necessarily recoil management. It is important to note that Jerry Michalik does grab the front of the trigger guard, so, you know, I think whatever it is he's doing is working. I don't know, it might be open to interpretation. Our trigger, this is a standard Glock Gen 3 trigger. So we have our trigger safety dingus set into the face of it there. This is a drop safe feature to make sure that the trigger cannot travel by either you not necessarily positively engaging with it, some sort of foreign material getting into the trigger guard, not positively engaging with it, or just dropping the gun. It cannot, the trigger cannot pick up momentum and fire itself. Something that SIG probably should have thought harder about. Now, when it comes to our trigger press, go ahead and remove this mag. So we have a very distinct wall. We have a little bit of mush getting to the wall. A not too bad let off. Like it's definitely, the let off is definitely stiff. Like it's not quite breaking a glass rod, but it's more tactile than some other pistols that I've shot. And then our reset is just ahead of that wall. Honestly, for a Glock trigger, this is not a bad trigger. The Glock triggers are frequently denounced as being quite terrible. I'm not too bothered by most Glock triggers, if I'm being completely honest. I'm also not necessarily what you would consider a trigger snob. What I will say is that there's a lot of people out there who just immediately swap out Glock triggers, and I think that's a touch of hubris. I still maintain that most guns outshoot the owners. And I also maintain that if you spent the time to really master a Glock trigger, you would get more out of a competition trigger after that than some sort of lightened, tricked out trigger after having become an expert on a stock trigger than if you just drop one in there. Like, you really can't actually buy performance. Training will trump purchased parts all day long. So something to consider there. But not a bad trigger overall. No complaints there. Our magazine release is located at the heel of the trigger guard, and there are some complaints here because I absolutely despise that super thin Gen 3 mag release. You can get extended mag releases and stuff like that. I've not been the biggest fan of some of those. Some of them are too extended. Like the very first version of extended mag release I ever ran into for a Gen 3 Glock was just the same overall surface area lengthened. And there were a couple times where I accidentally dropped a magazine. Some of that comes down, may better be attributed to my grip at the time, but it doesn't necessarily give me a whole lot of confidence with extended magazine releases on the Gen 3s. So I cannot necessarily reach this from my firing grip. So I either need to use my support hand, a method which I am not a fan of, or I have to turn the gun a little bit in my grip, reestablish my grip as I go to insert my magazine. Some things to take into consideration there. All right, our grip texture. The Gen 3 has very modest grip texture. I don't really get too bent out of shape over grip texture on a lot of handguns. I definitely don't mind having more aggressive grip texture than what is on this Gen 3. My bigger complaint with most guns is that the texture doesn't go high enough. I have a tendency to keep my lower fingers loose on my shooting hand whenever it is that I'm shooting a handgun. So my gripping is more happening up here. I would appreciate more texture up here. Now also, a lot of people don't necessarily like the texture of the Gen 3 Glocks. They wanted something more aggressive, so it's not uncommon to see a lot of Gen 3 Glocks home stippled or sent off to somebody to get stippled. Gen 3 also brought in the finger grooves, and the finger grooves are another hot button topic for an awful lot of people. I am not bothered by the finger grooves on most Glocks. They don't necessarily catch my fingers in the wrong place or anything along those lines. However, to say that is to also say that if I'm not bothered by their presence, I'm not bothered by their absence either. So, something to keep in mind there. For me, for the most part, on some of the larger guns, it gets a little touch and go, but like the larger frame Glocks, the 20, the 21, it can be a little touch and go. But on the standard like 9mm framed guns, no issues. No issues at all for me. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about the magazine. We have a 15-round magazine, and what's interesting is how the back of the magazine is sunk in. This magazine is dimensionally the same as a Glock 19. So we can see there I fit that magazine in there, no problem. However, a Glock 19 magazine is too long for long this way for a 380 cartridge. It'll dive bomb into the front of the magazine and be unreliable and all that kind of stuff. So they took a Glock 19 magazine and then they just shrank it in this way. I think the skeletonization in the back here looks kind of dumb. Like, I honestly think they probably could have just put a spacer on the inside that would have done the same thing. But whatever, 15 rounds, and it's the same size as a Glock 19 magazine, which means that it'll fit in like Glock 19 mag pouches and all that kind of stuff. Or standard mag pouches, I guess I should say. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers pretty much covers the features portion of this, not my thoughts on this discussion. Other than this being a Gen 3, came with 2 magazines, so I had to buy a third because I have to have a minimum of 3 magazines for all of my handguns. Thinking about actually increasing that to 5, but that's another topic for another time. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? All right, so let's go ahead and kind of break this down. Let's talk about like establishing a grip on it and all this kind of stuff. With this being a Glock 19 sized handgun, I have a full grip in order to be able to get all my fingers on and all that kind of stuff. Now, as I mentioned before, I keep these fingers down here more loose whenever it is that I'm shooting. So having a full length grip is not important to me from a recoil management standpoint as much as it is from a draw standpoint. Being able to get my whole hand on there and get this thing into action as fast as I can is helped by having more grip. And there are also tangible benefits to recoil management with more grip, more so from like a kind of pivot point in contact with the hand necessarily than reciprocating mass going over the top of the hand versus what it is that you have, surface area that you have available in order to be able to have recoil going against the rest of your hand, even if you're using a passive style grip. Maybe a conversation for another time to get deeper into. When it comes to mag changes and all that kind of stuff, I'm actually kind of surprised at how easy it is to hit this mag well. There's a tiny amount of like internal beveling, which does help. See, that didn't go so well. But it's not been bad overall. And when I can get engagement with the magazine release, the magazine drops freely. When it comes to presentation, this presents just like a Glock 19. Sights snap together. It's very naturally pointing guns. One of the great things about the 19 or other 19 size guns, 23, 32, so on and so forth. We already talked about the trigger. Let's go ahead and talk about recoil, because a lot of people would say, well, and have asked me, like, well, is this some sort of like sub-caliber trainer for a Glock 19 or a striker-fired 9mm handgun? And in the case of the Browning BDA 380, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description, yes, it kind of is. There's a very tangible benefit to the slightly weaker 380 cartridge in a metal-framed gun where you have less recoil. In a polymer-framed, blowback-operated pistol, no. I would actually put this recoil to be pretty comparable with that of the Glock 19. Now, does that mean that this thing's trying to like climb its way out of my hand every time I shoot it? No. The Glock 19 is a very mild recoiling handgun, so is this. I'm more pointing out that you're not getting some sort of recoil benefit by going with the 380 cartridge in this case, because blowback guns have a tendency to be a little bit more snappy. We can really see evidence of that with this particular handgun. It's not recoiling super heavy. It's recoiling heavier than I would expect for a 380 chambered Glock 19 sized handgun. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. that you're not getting that trade-off necessarily in this case. So if you are building somebody up into centerfire fighting-sized handguns, this still has benefits as an introduction. We're kind of getting into like recommendations here after in a little bit, so this is a bit of a read ahead. But be aware that at best you have a placebo effect just because you can show them like a 380 next to a 9mm and go like, see, this one's smaller, you're going to feel less recoil, and then have them shoot it. All right, guys. Does that pretty much cover my thoughts on shooting? Yep. All right, guys. That's shooting. What are our recommendations when it comes to this particular handgun? Would I recommend this for duty type use? Absolutely not. Entirely because of 380 ACP. I'm just not a fan of that for duty type use. So it has all of the duty type features that you could possibly want except for the chambering. Okay, well, what about self-defense, home defense? Well, this is where my answer changes a little bit. So 380, in my opinion, is on the right side of minimal. So for home defense, self-defense, I don't hate this option. Now, I don't know why you would go to this instead of a Glock 19, but in taste, there is no wrongs. So if this is what you want, or this is what it is that you came across and all that kind of stuff, then go for it. But you can get lights. It'll work in Glock 19 holsters, which is really great whenever it is that you're talking about it from a home defense, self-defense, or a self-defense type situation. Like if you already had a Glock 19, or if you just wanted to get this, you would have access to Glock 19 accessories and all those types of things. So that's nice. The sights are going to work. The holsters are going to work. If you throw a light on there, you're going to be able to find light-equipped holsters to be able to accommodate this firearm. Like there's some very tangible benefits involved with going with a Glock 25 in that case. However, when we're talking about the suboptimal penetration of 380, this is where we get to some issues. Now, I pull all of my ballistic data off of Lucky Gunner because they've been doing a long-term pistol cartridge comparison type deal with like ballistic gelatin. It's a really good resource. They list 2 380 loads that meet FBI minimum standards. The Hornady critical defense load achieving 12.8 inches of penetration, with 1.5 times expansion and a consistent expansion, and a SIG Elite load reaching 13.2. I might have that backwards, but regardless, 12.8 and 13.2. Anything, there's a bunch of stuff that comes in below that, and there's some stuff that surpasses that goes past 18 inches because it's not effectively expanding, it's just ice picking through the target. So that's my issue with this from a self-defense standpoint. When you talk about it from a home defense standpoint, that less penetration has some very tangible benefits because now you could be less concerned about potentially shooting a family member in the next room as you engage whatever threat. So you could make some pretty good arguments for this as a home defense gun, especially being able to add a light and all that kind of stuff. And with its size, like I don't think a Glock 19 size gun is necessarily restrictive to carry, but it is a little bit larger on the spectrum of guns that you could be carrying. But when we're talking about a home defense setup where it's a nightstand or something like that that's supporting the weight and size of the gun, that is not a detriment either. So this has some very tangible benefits as a home defense gun. I was actually employing this as such for a little bit. Okay, what about as a competition gun? Not a big fan of this as a competition gun, mostly because it's not legal for most competitions. Like I shoot IDPA right now. This would not be legal in any of the allowed or the accredited divisions within IDPA. I could take this into outlaw if I wanted to, and I might at some point, but like outlaw's just there practicing. They're not actually competitive. And I don't compete to be competitive, but I do like being able to look at everyone else's scores. And when I shoot outlaw type matches, I got no one else that I'm competing against. So it's not as fun at that point. To be able to like rate my times and figure out how it is that I need to adjust things and all that kind of thing. I can't do that when I can't do it in a division. It's not as effective when I can't do it in a division. If it is legal for competition in your given discipline, then I don't see anything wrong with going with it other than cost of ammunition. Right now, I'm finding 380 at some of the better prices I've ever seen 380 in the past couple of years, where it's kind of at the high end of what I expect to pay for 9mm. That, of course, will ebb and flow over time and all that kind of stuff. We're recovering. Nature is healing from the previous ammo rush, but I have no doubt that we'll move into another one before too much longer, and that will definitely impact prices. 380, Might stick around on shelves longer, so you might be able to stay in competition longer should there be another ammunition rush, but it will take longer for it to come back to shelves after, because the more mainstream cartridges are going to be prioritized at that point, like 9mm, 45, 5.56, before 380 is going to come back. Production capacity and all that kind of stuff is going to be geared more towards the things that sell. Okay, what about as a hunting pistol? No. I guess you could hunt small game with it, but I don't know why you would. There's a lot of better options for small game that would do better. What about as a woods gun? You know, defense in the woods. Well, if you're defending yourself from two-legged varmints, then yes, this would be acceptable for that purpose. And with it being a Glock, it's going to be durable and reliable and resistant to the elements and all that kind of stuff. So I could see why you might choose that if you were more worried about people than you were animals. But if you're worried about taking on like big cats and up, I would not choose this pistol. I would choose something much better, even within the Glock lineup, to be able to handle those types of threats. But if you're backpacking and you're only worried about like other people for whatever reason, then, I mean, it's at least a relatively lightweight gun. Ammunition being a little bit smaller would be a little bit lighter as well. You could make an argument for how this could fit into that. All right, guys, what are my uses for this gun? I have always had an interest in the 380 chambered Glocks, mostly because we could not get them in the United States. So when the Glock 42 came out, I was like, yes, I'm jumping on that. But I really did want the Glock 25 or the Glock 28 to come to US shores. So when they came to US shores, I was very excited. Not enough to run out and buy one, because I have a lot of guns on my gun list, and it's very difficult for me to pick just one and be like, I'm going to get that one right now. Generally, it's access and the right price. So, you know, I go to a shop, I see a gun that I want, I see that it's at a price that I consider baseline acceptable, and then I check around and see if anybody else has it for cheaper, and then I buy it. Like, I'm very laissez-faire whenever it comes to how it is that I acquire guns for the most part, unless there's something that's really driving me to preference going after a particular firearm at a given moment. So this was on my list, especially because I recently updated my list to where I just want all weird Glocks, because I just like collecting things. We're kind of at the point of past the point of practicality in my collection. We're now at the point of it's a collection, it's a museum. Guns have talking points, and this most definitely has talking points, as I have already demonstrated. Then a request came through on my Browning BDA 380 video asking me to review the Glock 25. So now I already had interest in the Glock 25. It was already on my list, and somebody wanted to see it on the channel. So 2 years later, I finally got around to buying one and reviewing it. Now, guys, it took me 2 years for a couple different reasons. I've had a lot of stuff going on. I've had funds being pulled in different directions and stuff like that. Other targets of opportunity popped up that I went ahead and actioned and all those types of things. But also keeping an eye out for a good deal. I had these in my local area, and they were slowly dwindling over time. I just wasn't necessarily seeing a price that really made me want to move. Now, when I decided that I was going to move on this handgun, it seemed as though everything in my area had disappeared. All the 25s have been bought. I checked online. I found one for a not so great price, probably evidence that I shouldn't have waited so long. But I knew that there was one more shop in town that I hadn't checked. So I went ahead and dropped by that shop, and lo and behold, in a dusty corner sat a Glock 25 for also the best price that I had seen. So it wound up working out in the end, luckily. So now I bought this, and sorry, bud. Sorry it took me 2 years to get around to reviewing it, but here we are. So, now we know why I have an interest in this, though. Murph, what are your uses for this gun? What are your recommendations when it comes to this gun? This is a collector. As much as I would feel confident in defending myself in a self-defense type situation with this handgun, I don't have any interest presently in trying to do that. I will say that when it came to reliability and stuff like that, I had early concerns, but I've run almost 200 rounds through this gun, and I've only had 2 light primer strikes, and I don't know if that was the gun or the ammunition. So it's something I'll be monitoring further, but I have a feeling that it didn't have as much to do with the gun as much as circumstances did at that time. So yes, it's reliable. I picked this gun up from the gun shop and immediately took it to the range and all that kind of stuff. Didn't clean it or nothing. It's run perfectly. It's run just like any other Glock. So ostensibly, I shouldn't have any concerns about taking this even into duty type applications. But I consider the 380 cartridge to be inadequate for duty type applications. So that sidelines this gun right off the bat. I have a Glock 19 and a Glock 23. What's this doing that they aren't? The ammunition is slightly more expensive. It's slightly less available. The defensive ammunition doesn't perform as well as the 9mm or the 40 Smith & Wesson. Like, what about this makes me want to use this gun? Nothing really. So these iron sights are probably going to stay in its original configuration. I don't think there's any modifications or anything I'm going to make to this gun. And it's just something that I'm going to take out and plink with occasionally because I don't have safe queens. A safe queen is just a gun that I don't intend to use. In my opinion, it's just a gun that I don't intend to use for like hard use purposes. But I'm still going to shoot this gun. I'm still going to train around this gun. I may even compete with this gun. But this is not something that's figuring prominently into my defensive strategy for myself. I have really good options that are already doing that. So with that being the case, what are some competitive offerings out on the market? Well, the Smith & Wesson Bodyguard 380 2.0, or Bodyguard 2.0 and 380. That gun is taking advantage of some of the new technology with like micro compact pistols with higher capacity, like double-digit capacity and all that kind of stuff, and pairing it with a 380 cartridge. That has some interest to me. It's a very small gun. It's very concealable. It's a little bit bigger than your average pocket pistol, like an LCP2 or something along those lines, which are absolutely miserable to shoot. That gun has more grip. It has a little bit more mass to it. It's going to be easier to handle. It's going to be a more effective fighting tool than most of your pocket 380s, while being a more convenient size than a Glock 25. If I go a little bit out of category, I would go with the, as mentioned before, previously reviewed Browning BDA 380. 13-round magazine, metal frame, lighter recoiling, and comparable in size. Apparently, well, yeah, pretty comparable in size to a Glock 19. Now, of course, it's a DASA gun, but I mean, DASA is kind of back right now. And I don't consider DASA to be a detriment as much as it just takes more time to train around it. That may be detrimental to you if you don't have a lot of time to train. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. That's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.
Go.